Dare to Defy Part 4, Parallel World, Book 3, written and narrated by Christine Kersey. Chapter 39. When we arrived at the gym, we checked in, got our towels, and went to the warm-up area. A couple of other kids were there, but they looked at Amy and left. "At least we get this space to ourselves." She smiled as she bent to touch her toes. "I didn't know you were such an optimist," I said. In reality, I didn't know my sister very well at all. She'd always just been a thorn in my side, not a friend. I kind of liked having her for a friend. She was kind of cool. "My mom always says if life gives you lemons, make lemonade," she said. I didn't remember Mom ever saying that, but maybe the mom in this world had a greater need to have that kind of attitude. We finished warming up, then headed to the treadmills. There weren't two next to each other, so when we got on, there was one between us with a boy on it. 10 minutes into our run, Austin stopped next to Amy. "Well, well, well, who do we have here? If it isn't little Miss Amy Campbell, baby sister to Morgan, I should feel so privileged that you would want to be in my gym." I looked over at them. Amy stared straight ahead, clearly trying to not let him get to her. He was facing my direction, and as I watched him watching Amy, revulsion crept up my spine. "Your big sister loved coming here to see me," Austin said. "She was my special friend. Did you know that? Have I told you that before?" "No, I wasn't," I wanted to yell. "But she left, and now I don't have a special friend." He paused as he stared at Amy, which gave me the creeps. "You look like you could use a friend, Amy. Maybe you could take her place." The thought of Amy being alone with Austin made my skin crawl. "What do you think, Amy?" he said. I couldn't take it anymore. "Can you come help me?" I called out to him. He turned to me and frowned, like he didn't appreciate being interrupted. "What do you want? Can't you see I'm busy?" Amy smiled at me with gratitude. "I'm not sure what my heart rate is supposed to be," I said. He sighed and came over. "What's your name?" "Hannah." He pulled a device out of his pocket and pressed some buttons, then told me what my target heart rate was. "Okay, thanks." "Hey, Austin," a girl called to him, and he walked away. Amy and I finished our workouts without further trouble from Austin, then went back to our floor. As we walked toward our rooms, I thought about Austin. I had to warn Amy about him. She was only 13. The likelihood that she would know what to do if he came on to her again was slim. "Amy," I said, stopping in the hall. "Yeah?" "That guy in the gym that was bugging you?" She frowned. "Austin?" I nodded. "I have a bad feeling about him. Make sure you're never alone with him." She looked at me with wide eyes. "Okay." Hoping my words would save her from danger, I smiled. We parted, and after I took a quick shower, I worked on homework before heading to the classroom floor for my nutritional counseling class. I had to admit that so far my stay hadn't been as bad as the last time. It seemed like the kids who were there for breaking a rule were the ones who got the worst treatment. Or maybe it was the drugs and the power bars that were making me feel more mellow about this whole thing. The next morning, Lori stayed by my side as I went to breakfast, evidently trying to prevent me from sitting with Amy. I turned in my food journal, got my food, and started walking toward the tables. "Wait up, Hannah," Lori said, making it clear she wouldn't take no for an answer. She caught up to me a second later. "You're going to sit with us, right?" "I didn't know you enjoyed my company so much." She laughed. "Of course I do." I knew that was a complete lie, but I pretended to believe her. "Okay." "Really? That's great." I set my tray on the table and sat down. Taylor, Madison, Emily, and Brittany were already there. "Hi, Hannah," Emily said. "What's up with you and that Amy girl?" Taylor asked, voicing what I was sure they were all thinking. I decided to make them work for any information. "What do you mean?" "I saw you sitting with her at dinner last night, and I wondered why." "Why shouldn't I?" I asked. "Is there something wrong with her?" Yeah," she said. She dragged out the word yeah, which silently added, "Isn't it obvious?" "She looks okay to me," I said. "What's the problem?" "In case you hadn't noticed," Madison said, "she's, toxic. Didn't you see that enforcer come over and hassle Lori because you were sitting with her?" "Why should the enforcers care who I sit with?" I asked as I shook my head. "I just don't understand." Of course I completely understood. As if being a stand-in for me wasn't punishment enough, the enforcers, and because of that, everyone else, tried to isolate her and make her as miserable as possible. "She's like a pariah," Madison said, "and if you're with her, you'll become one too." "Yeah," Taylor said, a grim look on her face, "and then you might infect us." She motioned to the assembled group at our table. "It's like a sickness, you see," Brittany chimed in, "a sickness we don't want to get." She paused. "I feel sorry for her just as much as the next person, but I have to look out for myself first." The others nodded. Even Emily seemed to agree, which disappointed me. I looked at Lori, who smiled in victory that everyone seemed to understand. Everyone but me, of course. "Maybe I'm not afraid of catching whatever it is she has," I said. They all looked shocked that I would think, let alone say, such a thing. "So I'm going to go ahead and sit at her table. But don't worry, I'll stay away from you guys." "That's not going to work," Lori said, her eyes blazing. "You still live in the same room as me, don't forget." That was impossible to forget, unfortunately. I debated whether to defy her or go along with her demands, but finally decided that as much as I wanted to push her buttons and do what I wanted, I didn't need another enemy. "Okay, fine." Lori smiled in triumph. "Good." I ate the rest of my breakfast in silence, occasionally looking at Amy and her two friends. Chloe, the one who didn't think I'd be back, shook her head at me one time, and I felt like a jerk because it turned out she was right. When I got to the supply closet/office on my floor to begin my morning shift, Kyle was waiting for me. "We have a problem," he said, obviously unhappy about something. Chapter 40. "What?" I asked Kyle. I was so wrapped up in my little drama with Amy and Lori that I couldn't think of anything that could be wrong. "You're not doing your job." "What do you mean?" "You skipped out on cleaning yesterday." My thoughts flew in 10 directions at once, rendering me speechless. "You don't deny it?" His firm conviction that what he said was accurate pushed words out of my mouth. "No, wait! That wasn't me." "Is there another Hannah Jacobs staying at Camp Willowmoss that I'm unaware of?" "No, I mean, I did my cleaning yesterday, but Jessica—" He cut me off. "Jessica is the one who reported your absence." This was unbelievable. "She was the one who didn't work. She told me she had homework to do." He laughed. "Look, Hannah, Jessica's been working for me for several weeks now and has been an exemplary worker. You, on the other hand, just started here. Do you really think I would believe you over Jessica?" Stunned, I stood there with my mouth hanging open. Then something occurred to me. "What about the cameras?" He looked bored now. "What cameras?" "The cameras in the hallway. Can you watch those from yesterday? You'll see that I was working the whole time." "I don't have time for that. Besides, they may have been down for maintenance yesterday." "What about when I came in to get the cart? You were there. You saw me." "That doesn't mean you actually did any work." "But did you see Jessica get her cart?" "Of course." With no way to prove my case, I had no option but to beg. "You have to believe me. I worked hard all day, but I wasn't able to finish one of the bathrooms because I ran out of time." A flicker of doubt flashed across his face, but it vanished as fast as it had appeared. "Look, Hannah, I won't accept any lying from my workers. I have a zero-tolerance policy, and those who choose to ignore it do so at their peril." My chin wobbled as frustration filled my chest, and when I spoke, my voice shook. "I'm telling the truth. I don't know what else to do to make you believe me." His expression softened ever so slightly, then he sighed. "I'll give you one last chance to prove to me that you're a good worker." I forced a smile onto my face, which was difficult since I was trying to keep from crying. "Get to work." I grabbed my cart and wheeled it out of the room and down the hall. I stopped by each bathroom, looking for Jessica, and found her in the 3rd bathroom. By this point, my frustration had morphed into fury that she had so blatantly lied and gotten me into trouble for something she had done. "Hey!" I yelled when I saw her hunched over a toilet with a sponge in her hand. She turned and looked at me, her brows pulled together in annoyance. "Yeah?" I stormed over to her and put my hands on my hips. "You lied to Kyle about what happened yesterday." She wiped sweat from her forehead and stood up. "I have no idea what you're talking about, Hannah." My mouth fell open in shock. "You'd better close that or flies will get in." She smiled. Despite her rudeness, I closed my mouth. You were the one who skipped work because you had homework, but you told Kyle it was me. You're crazy, Hannah. I was working the whole time. She seemed so confident in her answer that for a split second I wondered if I was crazy. But I knew it had happened. I shook my head. No. You said you needed to do homework and that it was cool if you skipped work. She turned back to the toilet. Whatever. Livid now, I stood there, my gaze burning holes into her head. She blithely went on cleaning the toilet, completely ignoring me. I turned and left before I did something I would later regret, like shoving her face into the toilet bowl and flushing several times. The thought made me smile, which took the edge off my anger. As I cleaned, I tried to forget about the injustice of the situation and was glad when Kyle checked up on me several times. Jessica couldn't claim I hadn't cleaned that day, not with Kyle seeing with his own eyes that I was doing it. My mind wandered as I scrubbed a shower and realized that the next day was Halloween. I hadn't heard any mention of it, though, and since candy was such an important part of Halloween, I could only assume the holiday had ended at the same time the laws regarding weight controls had taken effect, and it was no longer celebrated. If the next day was the last day of October, that meant there were only 11 days left until I had to be at the tunnel if I wanted to get back to my world. That wasn't much time to finish what I needed to do to the satisfaction of Jack and Danny so that they would get me out. I'd gotten some video for them with my glass cam, and I hoped they'd been able to hack into the Wi-Fi here and download the video. I'd also stashed several chunks of power bar that they could have tested at a lab, but I didn't know if it was enough yet. I also didn't know if the video I'd taken was enough to change people's minds about the inhumanity of the F.A.T centers. In just a few days, it would be Saturday, which meant the Saturday Challenge. That should be good for a lot of video that would get the attention of the public. But in the meantime, I needed to survive this place, gain Amy's trust so that she would come with me when it was time to leave, and make sure I was in position for the rescue. Chapter 41. I finished my shift and went to my room to work on homework. When it was time to go to lunch, I heard a soft knock on my door. I opened it to find Amy standing there. I invited her in. I understand why you didn't sit with me at breakfast. She stared at the floor as she spoke. My shoulders slumped. I was such a terrible sister. I'm so sorry, Amy. I really wanted to, but Lori basically threatened me. She nodded. Okay. Then she looked at me. What about lunch? I felt vile and cowardly. I can't. Her face seemed to droop even more. Okay. But let's work out together after classes, all right? She seemed to perk up at the suggestion. Okay. I'm ready to eat some lunch. Do you want to go with me to the cafeteria? Sure, she said. We arrived at the cafeteria together and got in line. About 30 seconds later, I felt a tug on my arm and saw Lori standing there pulling me. There you are, Hannah. I was looking for you. Come get in line with me and the girls. Her gaze flicked to Amy, then back to me. I'm fine here, I said as I gently pulled my arm out of her grasp. I'll meet you at the table, okay? She looked uncertain, but after a moment she nodded and walked away. I'm tempted to sit with you just to see what she does, I said to Amy. Do it, Hannah, Amy said, her eyes bright with hope. My heart pounded as I considered the consequences of defying Lori's demands. What could she do to me anyway, though? And who was more important, Lori or my baby sister? Okay, I said. Really? Grinning, I nodded. Cool, Amy whispered. At that moment, I felt proud of myself. Something I was doing was making my sister happy. We collected our food and went to her table. Chloe and Amber were already there. Wow, Chloe said. Look who decided to join us. I'm truly shocked. Amy laughed. Stop it, Chloe. I glared at the little smart aleck, although she was right. I'd even shocked myself by coming here. As soon as I sat down, I looked at Lori and her gang and saw them openly staring at me. Lori looked pissed. I turned away and focused on eating my lunch, making sure to put a large chunk of power bar in my pocket. During lunch, I looked over at Lori's table and saw Jessica sitting next to her and having what looked like an intense conversation. I hadn't realized the two were friends, but then I didn't know any of Lori's friends, except the 4 girls who sat at her table. Seeing the two of them talking worried me, particularly after what had happened that morning. I tried not to think about it and tried to focus on the fact that in less than 2 weeks I would be back in my home world with my family. After I finished eating, I stopped by my room and set the chunk of power bar on the bed, then pulled out the other pieces I'd stashed and set them next to the new piece. I turned on the camera and held it in front of my face so that I would be the one recorded. "I've collected some power bars now, just so you know," I said. Then I pointed the camera at the small pile of power bar chunks on the bed. I turned off the camera, put the pieces of the power bars back under the bed, and put the glasses back on, hopeful that giving that message might speed up the time for my and Amy's rescue. Next, I went to the supply closet/office to get my cart. Kyle wasn't there, but I hoped he would check on me that afternoon so he could verify I was working. I worked hard all afternoon and kept my distance from Jessica, though I saw her vacuuming the halls at the end of our shift. When I dropped off my cart, Kyle still wasn't around, but I tried not to worry and instead got my backpack and headed to class. My first class was English. Amy was already there, and when I arrived, she pointed to the desk next to hers. I turned in my paper to Mrs. Needham, then sat in the seat next to Amy. "I hope Lori didn't give you too hard a time about sitting with me," she said. "I actually haven't talked to her yet," I said. "Oh, well, I hope she leaves you alone. You should be able to be friends with whoever you want." Liking this spunky side of her, I nodded. After classes were over, I dropped off my backpack and went to the cafeteria. As I waited in line, I wondered if I should sit with Amy again or if I should sit with Lori. Then I remembered Amy saying that I should be able to choose my friends, so after I got my dinner, I walked toward Amy's table. No one was there yet, but as I walked in that direction, I heard my name and saw Emily motioning to me. Just she and Brittany were at their table. I stopped to see what they wanted, but didn't set my tray down. "Where are you going?" Emily's eyebrows pulled together like she was worried. "Are you going to sit with that girl again?" "That girl's name is Amy," I said, "and yes, I am." "But why?" "What's the big deal?" "Lori is so pissed at you. Why do you want to make her mad?" That gave me pause. I could tell she was mad when I sat with Amy at lunch, but I figured she would get over it. Evidently she hadn't. "I have the right to choose who I sit with, don't I?" "Well, yeah, but you need to be wise about it." Wise? What was that supposed to mean? "Okay." "You don't want Lori as your enemy," Brittany said. That was something I already knew, but I had to put aside my own fears and do what was best for my sister. That's why I was here in the first place. I couldn't let a bully like Lori keep me from doing what I knew was right. "I appreciate the warning." "So sit down." Emily patted the table next to her place. I looked at the spot she indicated, then looked at the line of kids getting food. Amy was in line, and just at that moment she turned and looked at me, then smiled and waved. Then I saw Lori, her tray full, walking toward us. Crap! "Come on, Hannah," Emily said. "Sit with us." I turned back to Emily. "I'm sorry, but I can't." "What?" The look of shock on her face almost made me laugh, like the thought of defying Lori was not even in the realm of her reality. "I'll see you later," I said. Then I walked over to Amy's table and waited for her to arrive. When she got there, she sat next to me. "I wasn't sure if you were going to sit here when I saw Lori going to her table." "Like you said, I can choose who I want for my friends." She smiled, obviously pleased. A few minutes later, Chloe and Amber joined us. As I ate, I tried to ignore the gnawing in my stomach that manifested itself whenever I thought about Lori. At the end of the meal, I stood and picked up my tray, but then was violently pushed from behind. I dropped my tray and everything on it and fell to the floor. "Pick up your trash," a male voice commanded. I turned to see Hanson standing over me and my heart rate skyrocketed. He pushed me with his boot. "Hurry up!" I quickly gathered the trash onto my tray, then stood. I looked at him. Hatred was plain in his eyes, but why would he hate Hannah Jacobs? He glared at me. "You're such a waste of space." Then he turned and walked away. "What was that all about?" Amber asked. I sat back down. "I don't know." "Maybe you remind him of someone too," Amy whispered. I looked at her sharply. Was she aware of the animosity Hanson had toward Morgan? Chapter 42. Amy and I went to the gym together, and I stayed close by while we worked out. I didn't want to give Austin another opportunity to proposition her. The thought disgusted me. She was only 13. But he was a pervert, and after what I knew about him and Alex, it didn't surprise me that he'd already approached her. The more time I spent with Amy, the more I considered telling her that I was her sister, but then I would remember how she'd calmly stated that she hated me with all her heart. Could the friendship we developed in the last couple of days be enough to overcome that? Or would she immediately scream to anyone who was near that I was really Morgan? That fear kept me quiet. We finished our workout without incident, then after a quick shower I headed to the nutritional counseling class. The moment I entered the room, the teacher pulled me aside. "Are you Hannah Jacobs?" she asked. Wary, I answered, "Yes." "You need to attend Mrs. Reynolds' re-education class." "What?" I would have thought she was joking, except I knew the staff never joked. "Don't argue with me." I didn't think I had been, but okay. "Goodbye." Then she turned away from me. I stood there a moment, wondering why I was being sent to that class. I hadn't done anything wrong that I was aware of. "Why are you still here?" the teacher asked. I glanced at her, then made my feet carry me toward the door, out into the hallway, into the classroom where I'd been humiliated many times during my last visit to Camp Willowmoss. When I walked through the doorway, all eyes shifted to me. I scanned the faces of the kids in the room and saw Amy, who looked happy, yet confused, to see me there, and Lori, whose mouth turned up into a half-smile when I walked in, like she wasn't surprised to see me there. Could she have anything to do with this? I remembered how she'd interfered with my budding relationship with Connor on several occasions and thought about the lies she told to the group at our table. It wasn't out of the realm of possibility for her to have done something to cause me to be sent here, especially since I knew she was furious with me for befriending Amy. "Hannah," Mrs. Reynolds said loud enough for everyone to hear, "what a great disappointment to see you here." And so it begins. "Don't just stand in the doorway. You're holding us up. Find a seat." There were a few empty seats, but none by either Lori or Amy, so I sat in the closest one, next to a boy with long hair. His hair reminded me of Billy, which made me miss him intensely. The last time I'd been in this group with Mrs. Reynolds, he'd been by my side. Forcing thoughts of Billy out of my head, I fiddled with my glasses and turned on the camera. I knew how Mrs. Reynolds treated us, and I wanted to make sure and have the camera going if something interesting happened. "Why are you here, Hannah?" Mrs. Reynolds asked. With her eagle-like stare focused on me, I felt the familiar fear trickle down my spine. Then I reminded myself that I knew something she didn't. I knew I was really Morgan Campbell. That didn't do anything to help me, and if she found out, it would actually be worse for me, but convincing myself that I had this great secret gave me the courage to speak up. "I have no idea," I said. She laughed and looked at the other kids. "She has no idea. Does anyone believe her?" Most of the kids just stared silently, but some shook their head. "The rest of you know why you're here, am I right?" Everyone nodded, and Lori nodded the most vigorously, like she was trying to be the teacher's pet. Evidently, Mrs. Reynolds preferred a pet-free environment because she looked at Lori and narrowed her eyes. "You seem quite eager to have us believe you know why you're here, Lori, so I'd like you to tell us." Lori's eyes widened, and her gaze ricocheted around the room. "I'd rather not say." Mrs. Reynolds laughed. "I'm sure you wouldn't, but that's not what I asked you, is it?" Lori looked worried now. "Go on," Mrs. Reynolds said. "Tell us why you're at Camp Willowmoss." I watched their interplay with fascination, thrilled that Lori was being forced to tell us what she'd done. I'd been dying to know, and now the information was being handed to me. Maybe being in this class, at least tonight, wasn't such a bad thing after all. "Well," Lori said, her face growing red, "I might have changed a few numbers in a report." "What kind of numbers?" Wait. "What kind of report?" A request submission." I had no idea what she was talking about and wondered what the issue was. "So what you're saying," Mrs. Reynolds said, obviously fully aware of the details, "is that you falsified someone's weight numbers on a request to have that person submitted to a F.A.T center. Is that accurate?" Lori's face turned a darker shade of red, and her voice dropped to a whisper. "Yes." "Speak up." "Yes," she said in a louder voice. "And what was the purpose of changing those numbers?" She cleared her throat. To show a pattern of weight gain. As this information was being revealed, I felt my anger growing. And showing such a pattern would make it more likely that the individual would be sent to a fat center, correct? Lori nodded. I can't hear the rocks rattling in your head, Lori. You need to speak. Yes, she said, her voice strained. I looked at the faces of the other kids. They all looked disgusted, yet fascinated by what she'd done. Do you realize the costs involved in housing people here? Mrs. Reynolds asked, the same rant she'd given me when I'd arrived. Lori began shaking her head, but then she said, No, it's very expensive. And who do you think pays for that? Mrs. Reynolds barely paused. The people of this society, that's who. Lori didn't say anything. I'm confused, Lori, Mrs. Reynolds said, obviously not confused at all. Your father heads the local fat squad in your area, correct? Mrs. Reynolds' eyebrows went up in a question, evidently waiting for Lori to confirm her words. Lori nodded. Yes. If someone is sent to a fat center because of his request, what's in it for you? Mrs. Reynolds asked. Why would you care if someone goes to a fat center or not? I just want what's best for everyone. She smiled, which seemed forced. A healthy world requires everyone to be healthy, right? Mrs. Reynolds smiled, but it was definitely fake. Of course, but in your case, there was more to it than that, wasn't there? Lori looked like she'd been caught with her hand in the cookie jar, if cookie jars existed in this world. Isn't it true, Mrs. Reynolds said, that your father gets a bonus if he submits a request to have someone taken to a fat center, and then that person actually goes to the fat center? And isn't it true that in this case he shared that bonus with you? Lori looked like she wanted to bolt from the room, but Mrs. Reynolds' gaze pinned her to the seat like a needle through a butterfly. Lori opened her mouth to speak, but she started coughing instead. Of course it's true, Mrs. Reynolds said, and this record falsification was only discovered when the same person came to the attention of the authorities and the authorities looked more closely at her file. In fact, it turns out that if the file had not been falsified, she would most likely have gotten off with a warning rather than being sent here. Mesmerized by the words coming out of Mrs. Reynolds' mouth, I sat perfectly still. One last question, Lori, Mrs. Reynolds said. What was the name of the person whose record you falsified? Lori had gotten her coughing fit under control, but she didn't seem at all eager to speak. We're waiting, Mrs. Reynolds said. Lori looked around, her eyes wide with fear. It was Morgan Campbell. Chapter 43. Everyone gasped, but somehow I managed to keep my expression neutral. In the back of my mind, I'd known she was talking about me as Mrs. Reynolds had described her crimes, but I was still stunned. I was only here because of what Lori had done. If she hadn't falsified my weight, I would never have come here. Amy jumped up and everyone's attention shifted to her. You lied, she screamed. You lied about my sister, and now I'm here, all because of you. Then Amy did something I wouldn't have thought her capable of. She lunged at Lori, knocking over her chair. The two of them fell to the floor, with Amy on top. My gaze flitted to Mrs. Reynolds, and I was appalled to see a tiny smile on her face. Disgusted by the fact that she seemed to view the fight between Lori and my sister as entertainment, I silently screamed at Amy to stop. Lori and Amy were shrieking, and a moment later a pair of enforcers burst into the room and pulled them apart. Both girls were breathing heavily. I'd never seen Amy so enraged. That's enough, one of the enforcers said as they shoved the girls back into their chairs. Thank you, Mrs. Reynolds said to the two men, who positioned themselves against the wall, I guess so they could jump in again if the need arose. Amy, I understand why you're upset, but what Lori did doesn't change anything for you. You're still here in your sister's place because she stabbed one of our enforcers, which is completely unacceptable. It's not fair, Amy said. You must know by now that many things in life are not fair, Mrs. Reynolds said. Nevertheless, we must accept what happens and put the good of all above the needs of one. I didn't understand how punishing Amy for what I had done was for the good of all, but I kept quiet. As I listened to Mrs. Reynolds lecture us, I turned off the camera. It looked like all the drama was over for now. I continued to wonder why I'd been told to come to this class. After the drama with Lori, Mrs. Reynolds had apparently forgotten the original question of why I was there because she didn't bring it up again. When the class was over, I walked with Amy to the elevator, but she was silent. We rode down to our floor without speaking, and it felt even less right to tell her who I really was. She seemed angrier than ever, and I could only guess it was because of me. "Do you want to talk?" I asked as we walked to our rooms. "I just want to be by myself right now." She avoided looking directly at me, and I wondered if that was because I reminded her of Morgan. "Okay," I said. "I'll see you tomorrow." She left without another word, and I went to my room and tried to collect my emotions before Lori showed up. As angry as Amy was, I was livid with Lori for lying about my weight and getting me thrown into this fat center. If she'd left things alone, I would be living my life back in Timber Hills, as would Amy. It's true I never would have met Billy, but that would have been for the best. I thought he was my friend, but he'd abandoned me. My thoughts flowed freely and my fury reached a boil. I breathed slowly and deeply, trying to get my emotions under control. Just in time, too, because Lori arrived moments later and she was in a very foul mood. "Are you happy now?" she demanded. I was as far from happy as I'd ever been. "About what exactly?" "Now you know why I'm here. You wanted to know, didn't you?" Even though that was true, I was actually happier not knowing. "That was a really rotten thing you did," I said. "What does it even matter?" she said. "Who even cares?" "I do," I wanted to scream, but forced myself to dial my anger back. "You ruined someone's life, Lori. More than one person's, actually." She rolled her eyes. "Again, who cares? Why do you care? Oh yeah, because your little friend Amy was sad. Boo-hoo." It took everything I had not to wrap my hands around her skinny little neck and squeeze. Instead, I put my hands into fists at my side, my nails digging into the tender flesh of my palms, and squeezed as hard as I could. "Speaking of her," Lori said, "why are you sitting at her table? I thought we decided you weren't going to do that anymore." I found it hard to speak through my clenched jaw. "I'll sit wherever I want." She looked at me with an expression of, "What do I care?" "Fine, but you may regret it." I heard a threat in her words, but after learning what she'd done to my family, I just couldn't work up enough worry to care what she said. She'd hurt me as much as she possibly could. Anything else was going to roll right off of me. "I'm going to bed," I said. She flicked her hand at me. "Do what you want." I gathered my things and went to the bathroom. When I came back to my room, Lori was gone. Her absence allowed me time to calm down, but it still took me a while to fall asleep. The next morning at breakfast, the whole cafeteria was buzzing with the information Lori had confessed. I sat with Amy. There was no debating about it this time. People were coming to Amy and greeting her. Evidently, a lot of the kids thought what Lori had done really sucked, which made them look at Amy in a different light. Instead of being the sister of a criminal who was now in hiding, she was the sister of someone who had been set up. Very different circumstances. But the enforcers didn't care about the shift in feelings. If anything, they seemed to take a harder line against Amy and anyone who was her friend. Maybe it was because Amy's sister had stabbed one of their own and escaped this place, but they yelled at kids to keep moving if they showed signs of stopping to talk to us. "I can't believe she did that," Chloe said, glancing toward Lori's table. I looked that way too. Lori sat there, her head held high as the other 4 girls sat glumly, obviously aware that everyone was looking at them and talking about them. "I don't want to talk about it," Amy said. I totally understood her stance. I didn't want to talk about it either. Just thinking about the injustice of it made me furious. At the end of breakfast, I went to my floor to begin my final shift, and when I went to the supply room/office, Kyle was waiting for me. He looked mad. Chapter 44. "I don't like being played," Kyle said. I flashed to Jessica talking to Lori the day before, and then thought about being sent to the re-education class. I instinctively knew both of those things were related to this. "I did all of my cleaning yesterday. You even saw me." "I saw the bathrooms where you were supposedly cleaning, but when I inspected it later, you hadn't done a very good job. It was almost as if you were putting on a show for me." When I'd finished with those bathrooms, they'd been sparkling. If they were dirty when he checked up on my work, it could only be because someone had purposely dirtied them. It wasn't a show, I said. I worked hard and I cleaned the bathrooms completely. He shook his head and frowned. That's not what it looked like to me. Sighing, I tried to think of some other defense, but nothing came to mind. What was I supposed to say? So, you know your star worker Jessica? Yeah, well, she was conspiring with my wicked roommate Lori, and I'm sure they messed up the bathroom on purpose to make me look bad, all because I'm friends with Amy Campbell. No, I can't prove it, but that's what I think happened. Right, that would win me all kinds of points. Instead, I said, I don't know how I can prove it to you. Good news, he said, but he didn't smile. You won't have to. I'm kicking you off my team and having you reassigned. Huh, I thought. This could be either really good or really bad. And by the way, that's why you're now attending the re-education class. He glared at me. You need to learn to follow the rules. I'll be out of here in a few days, I repeated to myself over and over, trying to hold down the fury that was building. What's my new assignment? I asked. He grinned. I don't know. You need to meet with Mrs. Reynolds to find out. Great. Go wait in your room for someone to come get you. I trudged to my room and sat on my bed, stewing in a deep pot of anxiety. Not only would I have to face Mrs. Reynolds one-on-one, but she would assign me to some unknown job. But what could be worse than cleaning the bathrooms? A short time later, someone knocked at my door. I opened it to find Katie standing there, and once again I wondered what had happened to Kiera, the girl who had been my escort on my last visit. I couldn't very well ask Katie without dredging up a bunch of questions like how did I know Kiera was at Camp Willowmoss and how did I know she was an errand girl? Then I thought of a way to ask. Hi, Hannah. Hey. I guess you need to meet with your caseworker? So I'm told. Okay, come with me. I followed her to the bank of elevators and she waved her car in front of the reader. So, Katie, how long have you had this job? It seems pretty sweet. She smiled. Yeah, I really like it. I've been doing it for about 2 weeks. How did you get that job? Did you, know the person you were replacing and ask her to recommend you? Actually, yeah, she said. Kiera and I were friends, and when she left, she suggested me. Bingo. Where did she go? Back home. She finished her time and she was able to leave. Mystery solved. At least now I knew people actually left Camp Willowmoss. Of course, my old roommate Alex had apparently left, but my old friends Piper and Cassidy were still around. I wished I could talk to them and see how they were doing, but I would be crazy to reveal my true identity, so that was a no-go. A short time later, we walked into the waiting area and Katie left me with the enforcer who was always there and who never seemed to smile. I sat down without being told, I knew the drill, and waited for Mrs. Reynolds to come get me so she could announce my fate. She must have been busy because she made me wait 20 minutes, or, more likely, she just wanted me to know that she was the one in control, as if I had any doubt. It's you again, she said in greeting, a deep frown on her face. Yep. I couldn't help it. The way they treated me begged for my disrespect. Of course, I would only go so far. I'd learned better than to be blatantly rude. She sniffed. Follow me. Then she turned and strode down the hall to her office. Like an obedient puppy, I followed her, well aware that the enforcer would be more than happy to put me in my place. We entered her office and she sat behind her desk. I sat in a chair across from her. We're back to asking the question I asked last night, Hannah. Why are you here? Because I was set up, I wanted to say, but I bit my tongue to keep the words from exiting my lips. I settled for, I don't know. She laughed. You and I both know that's not true. She leaned forward like this was just girl talk. Be honest with me, Hannah. Why do you think you're here? I met her gaze and decided to tell her what I knew. This is all a mistake. I did my job like I was supposed to. Someone messed it up and now Kyle thinks I didn't actually work. She tapped her chin. That is a dilemma, isn't it? But there's really no way to know who's telling the truth, is there? It seemed like a rhetorical question, so I stayed quiet. She sat up straight like she'd just thought of something. There just might be a way. That sounded promising. Is it important to you that we learn the truth, Hannah? This felt like a trick question, but I wasn't sure why. Yes. She clapped her hands once. Very good. I'll arrange for you to have a lie detector test administered during this evening's meeting." Oh no, I thought, as panic built inside me. What have I gotten myself into? "What if I don't want to take it?" She looked confused. "Why ever not? Don't you want to prove that you're telling the truth?" "Well, yes." I frantically tried to think of a reason. "But I've never taken one of those tests before. How do I know it will work right? What if it says I'm lying when I'm really not?" "Oh," she said, "they're very accurate." My biggest fear was that they would somehow get me to admit that I was really Morgan Campbell. "I don't want to take it." I hoped that would be enough. It wasn't. "It's been decided. You're taking it." She said it like the decision had been made way before she'd suggested it. Had it? If so, why? Alarm bells clanged wildly in my head. Extreme anxiety made me bold. "When was this decided?" She gave me a stern look. "Are you questioning me?" I wanted to say, "Who else would I be questioning since there's no one else in the room?" Instead, I said, "No." "I should hope not. Now go back out to the waiting area." "Kyle said you were going to give me a new work assignment?" She waved her hand. "That has yet to be decided. For now, you'll continue as normal." I wondered what Kyle would say when I showed up to get my cart. "Okay." "Go. I'll see you in class this evening." I must have looked worried because she added, "I'm sure it will be fine, Hannah. The truth will come out and all will be well." I knew for a fact that if the truth came out, not only would all not be well, but the crap would really hit the fan. Chapter 45. I left Mrs. Reynolds' office and sat in the waiting area until Katie came and got me and brought me back to the 8th floor. When I went to the supply closet/office, Kyle was there. I paused as I waited for him to yell at me. When he didn't, I said, So I guess I still work for you." He looked up from the tablet where he was tapping something in. "So I heard." At least it wasn't a surprise to him. He looked back at his tablet, dismissing me. I grabbed the cart and wheeled it out. The meeting with Mrs. Reynolds had taken nearly 40 minutes, thanks to her making me wait, so I had a lot of work to make up. I passed the bathroom where Jessica was working, but I just wasn't up to a fight, so I kept going. I stopped at the next bathroom, which looked like it hadn't been cleaned yet, and got to work. As I washed the mirrors, I thought about how that night's lie detector test might go. I tried to comfort myself with the idea that they couldn't make me say anything I didn't want to, so really I would be in control, right? The unknown scared me to death. I had no idea what their test really involved, and after witnessing Lori's takedown the night before, I had no doubt Mrs. Reynolds would be more than happy to humiliate me in front of everyone. I thought about Amy and how she would be a witness to whatever happened. What if the truth came out that I was really her sister? How awful would it be for her to find out like that in front of everyone? I owed it to her to tell her the truth, in private. But would I be risking my future for nothing? What if I told her and then nothing happened during the test? What if she decided to tell someone what I told her because she hated my guts? Could I take that chance? I sighed as I began scrubbing the first sink. Even if I decided to confess to her, I wouldn't have the chance to talk to her privately until after dinner. I would see how the day went and make my decision then. Feeling moderately better, I focused on the job at hand and made sure I did my best. Toward the end of my first shift, Kyle stopped by and inspected my work. "That looks good, Hannah." His praise hardly made me feel better since he thought I was lying about the work I had done the day before, not to mention that he thought I'd skipped out completely the day before that. But at least he saw that today I was cleaning and doing it right. "Thanks," I muttered. After Kyle left, I finished what I was doing, then took the cart back to the supply room/office, then went to my room to work on homework. When it was time to go to lunch, I heard a knock at my door. Amy had stopped by at the same time the day before. Frozen with indecision, I stared at the door. Whoever it was knocked again, pulling me out of my stupor, and I opened the door. Sure enough, there stood my little sister, although she was nearly as tall as me. "Hi, Amy." "Hey." I opened the door wider. "Come in." I just came to get you for lunch, she said. Oh, that made my decision easy. I couldn't tell her anything now, right before we went to lunch. Great. We took the elevator down to the cafeteria, got our food, and went to her table. She scooped up a spork full of tofu and asked, "So, what's new?" I stopped with my spork halfway to my mouth. Well, something actually did happen this morning." Her eyes widened. "What?" I told her about Kyle accusing me of not doing my job and then meeting with Mrs. Reynolds. Now she wants me to take a lie detector test during our class tonight. In front of everyone? Amy asked. Yeah. At least everyone will know you weren't lying. I nodded. Yeah. Hey, Chloe said as she and Amber joined us. Mrs. Reynolds is making Hannah take a lie detector test in our re-ed class tonight, Amy said. Chloe looked at me. Weird. What'd you do? Once again, I wanted to throttle Amy's roommate, but I just smiled. I didn't do anything. That's the point. Oh. Chloe gave Amy a look that said, tell me later. We ate the rest of the meal without my issues coming up. Then I finished working my afternoon shift. Again, Kyle checked up on me, and again, I was glad about it. I went to my first class, social studies, and saw Piper talking to a girl I didn't know. I sat where she wouldn't notice me. Next, I had science with Amy. Are you nervous about tonight? She asked as we waited for class to begin. I was extremely nervous, but not for the reason she might have thought. Kinda, I guess. I would be, she said. I mean, after what happened to Lori last night and with everyone watching? Like that hadn't crossed my mind. I nodded and looked at her. I needed to tell her the truth. I need to talk to you, I blurted. About what? I couldn't believe I just said that, but it seemed my subconscious had made the decision without me. Still, it felt right. I can't say right now, I said. Can you talk after dinner? Of course. I could tell she was curious, but now that I'd piqued her interest, I had to make her wait. After class, we went to dinner together. I had to give Amy credit. She didn't ask once about what I needed to talk to her about. The Amy I remembered would have pestered me until I regretted bringing it up. As was his usual routine, Hanson came by our table and gave me a hard time. I wasn't sure why he zeroed in on me. Amy was the one everyone seemed to bully. But he'd seemed to dislike me from the moment I'd arrived. Maybe Amy was right, and I reminded him of Morgan. As soon as we finished eating, Amy jumped up. I have homework to do. She turned to me. Hannah, you promised to help me with our science homework, remember? I saw right through her ploy. Smiling, I stood. Yep, let's go. Very few kids were leaving the cafeteria, so we got right on an elevator and went to our floor. Can we go to your room? I asked. All I needed was for Lori to stop by in the middle of the drama that was sure to unfold. Sure, she said. Do you think Chloe is going to stop by anytime soon? I don't know. Amy looked even more intrigued now. Better for Chloe to interrupt than Lori. Okay, I said. Moments later, we walked into Amy's room. She closed the door, then spun around, a mischievous look in her eye. Okay, what's going on? My heart rattled in my chest as several possible outcomes raced through my mind. My mouth had become bone dry, and I had to cough a few times to clear my throat. Amy's expression changed from curiosity to wariness. Something's wrong, she said. Isn't it? I nodded. Sort of. Why couldn't I just spit it out already? Here. She grabbed me by the arm and steered me to her bed. Sit down. I sank onto her bedspread and she sat next to me, her face intense. Tell me what it is. She paused. Did something happen with Lori? Her eyes narrowed as she said Lori's name. If only it were that simple. I shook my head. She stared at me, which reminded me of Mom, which made me miss Mom and everyone so intensely that I thought my heart would burst. I threw my arms around her and said, Oh, Amy. My voice was muffled as I spoke against her shoulder. She patted my back. What is it? What is it, Hannah? I pulled away and looked at her, then took a deep breath. I exhaled. Then in a rush, and in my normal voice, I said, It's me, Morgan. Chapter 46. She recoiled like I'd slapped her. Then confusion and hurt flashed across her face. Finally, she shook her head. I don't understand. I took off my glasses and leaned closer. Don't you recognize me? She studied me, looking me up and down. But your eyes are the wrong color, and your hair, and you just look different. Relieved she hadn't run from the room screaming, I smiled. That was kind of the point, to, hide my identity. Anger sparked in her eyes, and her voice shook as she spoke. How could you do this to me? It's your fault that I'm in here. It was as if she'd shoved a knife into my heart. I'm so sorry, Amy. I never meant for you to have to go through this. She glared at me. But I am, aren't I? Just because you didn't mean for me to, that doesn't change the hell I've been through, that I'm still going through, does it? The knife twisted this way and that with each word she spoke. She still hated me. Tears welled up in my eyes and I turned away, ashamed for all the pain that I'd caused her. I wiped at my eyes and turned back. Please forgive me, Amy, please. She gazed at me a moment, then she stared at her lap. Finally, she looked at me. She sighed, and the anger in her eyes faded. I don't understand though, Morgan. Why? Why would you come here now? My voice dropped to a whisper. Because of you, Amy. To get you out. Oh. Her fury seemed to have run its course, and as I spoke, my voice shook with threat and tears. Please don't hate me. She gazed at me for a moment, her eyes softening. Then she burst into tears. I could never hate you, Morgan. You're my sister. Just then the door opened, and in walked Chloe and Amber. Chloe looked at Amy's tear-streaked face, then she looked at me. What did you do? I laughed, which made Chloe look even more furious, but I couldn't help it. I was glad Amy had such a fierce friend. It's okay, Chloe, Amy said through her tears. Chloe rushed over to her. What's wrong, Amy? What happened? Amy looked at me, then back at Chloe. Everything's going to be fine. Her tears slowed. Could you just give us a little time? I guess. She backed away, still looking at me with suspicion. Let's go to your room, Amber. Then they left. Thanks for not telling her who I am, I said. Amy looked offended. Do you think I'm stupid? Not at all. And I meant it. She was very savvy about this place. I just mean... Never mind. She smiled. It's okay. Don't worry. I won't tell anyone. She paused. But how did you get in here? How did you trick the eye scanner thing? I told her about meeting Jack and Danny and our plan to get information to share with the world. She wanted to see the glasses. I handed them over and she examined them but couldn't detect the camera. I told her how the plan was for them to come get the two of us out once they had the information they needed. I didn't mention my deadline of November 10th. I told her that as soon as I'd seen the enforcers taking her away, that was when I'd begun planning everything. You're doing all this for me? She asked. Yes, of course. You're my sister. She smiled. But I don't understand the deal Mom made that got you sent here. She laughed. Oh, believe me, there was no deal. That's just what they said. They took me even though Mom begged them not to. I should have known Mom would never agree to any sort of deal. What's going to happen after I get out? She asked. Am I going to have to be in hiding forever? Will they take Mom and put her in here? I didn't want to think about that part of the plan because I wasn't sure what would happen, but I didn't see any reason to worry Amy. I'm still working on that angle, I said, but don't worry, we'll figure it out. Now I sounded like Jack and Danny. Okay. Amy obviously had complete trust in me, which made me feel even more responsible. She was quiet for a minute. What if they find out who you really are during that lie detector test? That was my worry too, but I didn't want her to stress over it. They can't make me say anything, so I just won't tell them. She nodded, accepting my reasoning without question. We should probably do our workout, I said. No sense in getting ourselves into trouble. Yeah. She stood. I'll come get you after I change. Okay. I stood as well, and when she threw her arms around me and held me for several moments, My heart warmed with a love for my sister that I'd never experienced before. I was glad I'd put myself at risk for her. I went to my room and changed, and a short time later the two of us arrived at the gym. We warmed up, then I got on an elliptical machine and Amy got on a stationary bicycle. It must have been Austin's night off, because an enforcer I'd never seen before was monitoring the kids working out. After we finished our workouts, we went back to our floor. As I showered and got ready to go to the re-education class, I tried to control my anxiety, but as I thought about Amy and her reaction to finding out it was me, I felt better. The two of us went to the classroom floor together. When we walked into the classroom, my gaze shot right to a table and chair that had been placed in front of the room. A blood pressure cuff sat on the table, along with a small metal box that had wires coming out of it. Attached to the wires were two wide straps. The blood drained from my face. "Oh my gosh, Amy!" She grabbed my hand and squeezed. "It will be okay." Her voice was low. "Just don't say anything you don't want them to know." So glad she was on my side, I squeezed her hand back. She let go of my hand and we sat down. A lot of the kids were already there and I could see the questioning looks on their faces. They had no idea what was going on, but every one of them looked worried. I almost wanted to scream, "It's not for you!" but I was so scared that I was virtually paralyzed. Trying not to think about what was going to happen next, I stared at the floor. Lori walked in, which got my attention. Fresh anger displaced some of my terror, but when Mrs. Reynolds entered the room, a bright smile on her face, I forgot about Lori. "Good evening," she said. No one spoke. "All arise for the pledge." As we stood and recited the hated words, my gaze kept straying to the table and chair. "Very good. You may sit." She paused. "I'm sure you've all noticed the additional furniture in the room this evening." She motioned to the table and chair. "One of you, and you know who you are, has agreed to undergo a polygraph test to refute an accusation." I'd never agreed to the test. She was making me do it. "At the end of our session," she continued, "that person will have her chance to prove the truth of her statement." I have to wait until the end, I thought. My anxiety ratcheted up several notches. "Let us begin," she said, her face serene. "Last night, Lori shared with us her despicable act that got her sent here." I looked at Lori, whose face had turned bright red. If all I had to worry about was being embarrassed, I'd be thrilled. "What do you think about her behavior?" Mrs. Reynolds asked the group. Amy's hand shot up. Mrs. Reynolds smiled. "Yes, Amy." "She was being completely selfish and totally ignored the meaning of the pledge." "Which is?" "To put the good of others above oneself, of course. She didn't care about anyone, only about herself." "Very good." Mrs. Reynolds smiled in obvious approval. "Which is why she was sentenced to spend time in Camp Willowmoss, to relearn the importance of putting the needs of others above her own." She turned her eyes to Lori. "You've been here several weeks, Lori. What have you learned since arriving?" Her cheeks and neck had red splotches and she twisted her hands in her lap. "I've learned that it's better to think of others before myself." I had to hold back a snort. She may have learned that, but she certainly didn't practice it. "I'm glad to hear that, Lori," Mrs. Reynolds said. Then she moved on to another topic. About 20 minutes before we were scheduled to finish, 2 enforcers walked in. My face paled as my heart rate went into the stratosphere. It was time. Chapter 47. "I see our helpers are here," Mrs. Reynolds said, perfectly calm. Then she looked directly at me. "Hannah, please come to the front of the room." All eyes shot to me. When I looked at the others in the room, the most dominant expression was one of relief. Relief that it wasn't them being called up. I looked at Lori and saw a tiny smile on her face. But when I looked at Amy, I saw nothing but compassion, which helped to calm me. As I stood and walked to the front of the room, I turned on the camera in my glasses. One of the enforcers pointed to the chair. "Sit here." I did as instructed, trying to pretend like nothing was out of the ordinary. He put the 2 straps around my chest, the blood pressure cuff on my upper arm, and placed 2 small clips on 2 fingers. Then he and the other enforcer moved to the wall, their stance watchful. Mrs. Reynolds slid into the seat behind the table and turned to the room. As many of you know, a polygraph test will measure the body's response to questions being asked. If Hannah tells the truth, the polygraph will record one type of response, and if she lies, it will record another. She smiled at me. We will begin. She tapped on a tablet computer, then looked at me. Please answer with a yes or no. She paused. Is your name Hannah Jacobs? I knew this should have been an easy question, but since I would be lying, I wondered if the test results would be messed up. Be Hannah, be Hannah, be Hannah, I told myself. Yes. Are you 16 years old? That was easier. Yes. Is your roommate Lori? I was sure thoughts of her made my blood pressure spike, but I couldn't help it. Yes. She asked me some other innocuous questions, then she got to the point of the test. Have you been doing your assigned job each day? Yes. I said the word with conviction. Have you ever cut your shift short? No. Again, no doubt. Have you done your job fully and completely? Yes. This was getting easier. She became quiet as she examined the readout on her tablet. The squiggly lines meant nothing to me, and I wondered what they told her. One last question. I was so glad this was almost over. It hadn't been bad at all. And as it had turned out, I'd really had nothing to worry about. Is your name really Morgan Campbell? The room erupted in chatter. My chest compressed with complete and utter terror. This whole thing had been a ruse to get to this one question. No! No! My voice was hardly audible over the chaos in the room as everyone spoke at once. Quiet, Mrs. Reynolds said as she stood and faced the room. I will have silence. The noise in the room shut off as if she'd pressed the mute button. My eyes went to Amy, and she looked stricken. She mouthed the word, How? I was wondering the same thing. Mrs. Reynolds sat back down. Let me ask you again. I noticed the enforcers moving in. Are you Morgan Campbell? Amy leapt from her chair. No, she's Hannah Jacobs. Sit down, Amy, Mrs. Reynolds said, her voice deadly calm. I'll deal with you in a moment. Amy sank into her chair with a look of defeat. Mrs. Reynolds looked at me, her eyebrows raised in question. The enforcers stood on either side of me, which didn't help. Be Hannah, be Hannah, be Hannah. No. Her eyes narrowed as she stared me down. Finally, she said, You're lying. She hadn't even looked at the readout on her tablet. I couldn't tear my gaze away from her face. We have a sample of your DNA, she said, and it is an exact match with Morgan Campbell's. My shoulders slumped. I'd been caught. They'd known all along. My gaze went to Lori. Several emotions played across her face, but when our eyes met, the most powerful emotion I saw was satisfaction. My forehead creased as I tried to understand why she would feel that way. Was it because she was stuck in here and hadn't liked the idea that I'd been free? Or was it just the base meanness she'd always exhibited? My analysis of Lori came to an abrupt end when one of the enforcers grabbed me by the shoulders and yanked me out of the chair. The other ripped off the equipment I'd been wearing before twisting my arms behind my back and snapping handcuffs onto my wrists. How long had they known? Had it been from the first day, or had they only discovered it? But what did it even matter? They knew. I was screwed. Amy flew from her chair and flung herself against me. I won't let them take you, Morgan. I won't. Hot tears filled my eyes and rolled down my cheeks at my little sister's devotion. She was taking a big risk by stepping forward. It just didn't happen here. But she was doing it for me. It will be okay, Amy, I murmured into her hair, although I knew as clearly as I knew that she loved me that it would not be okay. Back off, one of the enforcers demanded. Then he forcibly pulled her away from me and shoved her toward the rest of the group who were watching in morbid fascination. Amy refused to sit in her chair, standing where she'd stopped. I wiped my cheeks on my shoulders as best as I could with my arms behind my back and gave her what I hoped was an encouraging smile. My only hope was that Jack and Danny were able to download the video I was recording and that they would come rescue me immediately. But would they? Would they be willing to reveal themselves for me? Had they gotten enough information to help their cause? I turned to Mrs. Reynolds. "You'll let my sister go now, right?" She smiled in her fake way. "Of course. She was only here because you weren't. Now she'll be free to go." That, at least, was a consolation. "When? When will you release her?" "Tomorrow morning, at the same time you're transferred." "Transferred?" "That's right. To a more secure facility." How could Jack and Danny rescue me if I wasn't here? Would they even know where I was? Would this completely change their plans? My heart stuttered against my ribs. Today was October 31st. Happy Halloween. The trick was on me. But that meant I only had 10 days before I had to get to the tunnel. If I was late, I would not be able to get back to my world. I vividly recalled the trip Billy and I had made, and the intense disappointment I felt when it had turned out I was still in this awful world. I simply had to succeed, but it would be difficult, if not impossible, if I was locked up in a completely different place. As my hopes slipped away, my knees buckled and I started to collapse. The enforcer who held onto my arm tightened his grip, then lowered me to the chair. They'd already cuffed me. I wasn't going anywhere. "You are all dismissed," Mrs. Reynolds said to the group. They stood there for a minute, evidently still in shock by what had just taken place. Amy stared at me, her face contorted with sadness. "Go," one of the enforcers said, and the group shuffled toward the door. Even Amy was forced along, her shoulders shaking with sobs. I was left alone with Mrs. Reynolds and the two enforcers. My worst nightmare had come true. This has been Dare to Defy Part 4, Parallel World, Book 3. Written and narrated by Christine Kersey. Copyright 2013 by Christine Kersey. Morgan's story continues in Dare to Defy Part 5.